The post clerk had already read the letter. She could tell by the crease where the seal had been broken and pressed flat again, poorly, and by the way his eyes followed her face instead of returning to his ledger. The page inside was damp from rain that had found a seam in the postal bag. One sentence in a cramped hand. No money. No address. No mention of the boy standing beside her in mud-covered shoes, tugging her sleeve, asking if his father had sent candy. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. Outside, cold drizzle fell on Bottineau, and the road south toward her claim stretched 12 miles into a winter she was no longer supposed to survive alone. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late September 1887, no money inside, just a single page in Peter Kvama's cramped hand, the ink smeared where rain had found a seam in the postal bag. Gone where wages are paid in cash. That was all. No address, no promise of return, no mention of his son. Marit Kvama stood in the doorway of the Bottineau post office and read the sentence twice. The post clerk watched her from behind his counter. He had already read it. She could tell by the way his eyes moved to her face instead of his ledger. The letter's seal had been broken and pressed flat again, poorly. Her private shame had already become public knowledge before she even held the paper. Oddman tugged her sleeve. 6 years old, thin-chested, standing in mud that covered the tops of his shoes. He asked if his father had sent candy. Marit folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She took Oddman's hand and walked out into the cold drizzle that had been falling on Bottineau since dawn. Peter had left in August with $41. Every cent they had saved from his railroad wages and her laundry work. He said Montana paid better. He said he would send money within 3 weeks. 7 weeks passed. Then the letter. She had $18.75 left. That was what remained after flour, beans, and salt pork. 1 sack of flour, 40 pounds of beans, 6 pounds of salt pork. Enough food to last until late November if she stretched it, and Oddman did not grow, which he would, because children do not stop growing because their fathers leave. The claim was 12 miles south of Bottineau, on the southern edge of the Turtle Mountain timber belt. 160 acres of exposed grassland with a strip of woods along the northern boundary. Peter had filed the homestead papers in both their names, which meant Marit could hold the claim as a deserted wife, but only if she lived on it, only if she improved it, only if she survived. The dwelling was a 10 by 12-foot claim shanty built of single-ply boards. Peter had raised it in 4 days the previous spring with help from a man who owed him wages. The boards were rough-cut pine, 1/4-inch gaps between them where the wood had shrunk through summer heat. No tar paper on the outside. No sod banking at the base. A tarred canvas roof patched twice where wind had lifted the corners. 1 sheet iron stove with a cracked elbow joint that leaked smoke when the draft pulled wrong. 1/2 cord of cottonwood sat stacked beside the east wall. 1/2 cord. Marit did not need anyone to tell her what that meant, but someone told her anyway. Aslak van Gen arrived 3 days after the letter. 61 years old, Norwegian-born, a sawyer who had cut timber for half the settlement around Bottineau. He had witnessed claims, measured quarter sections, and buried 2 neighbors who froze in the winter of 1884. He came because the post clerk told the storekeeper, and the storekeeper told Aslak, and Aslak felt it was his business to inspect situations that might become problems. He did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the shanty first, tapping the boards with the stem of his pipe. Each tap produced a thin, hollow sound like knocking on a shipping crate. He put his eye to a seam between 2 boards and looked through to the inside, where Oddman sat on a straw tick eating cold beans from a tin cup. Then he came to the door. "1 board," Aslak van Gen said. He held up a single finger. "1 board between your boy and January. That is not a house, Marit. That is a box." Marit said nothing. She knew what he was going to say next because she had already said it to herself every night since Peter's letter. Aslak walked the interior. He measured nothing with instruments. He measured everything with his eyes and 40 years of knowing what winter did to insufficient shelter. "Walls," he said. "1 inch of pine with daylight showing. I can see grass through the south side." He moved to the roof. "Canvas over boards, 2 patches. The first hard wind will peel it back." He opened the stove door and looked inside. "Too small. You will need to feed it every 2 hours in deep cold, and it will still lose the fight." He nudged the cracked elbow joint with his boot. "This leaks. You will either freeze or choke. Pick one." He stepped outside and looked at the woodpile. He was quiet for a moment. "Half a cord," Aslak said. "Maybe less. Cottonwood burns fast and cool. A proper winter needs 6 cords of hardwood. 6. You have enough here for 2 weeks of mild weather." Marit followed him outside. The September wind pushed through her shawl and found the places where the wool had thinned. "Delivered wood is $3.25 a cord," Aslak said, "plus hauling. That is $20 for 6 cords delivered if you could find a man willing to haul it 12 miles. Tar paper and nails for the walls. Another $11. And you would still need someone to drive the nails. You have no ox team. You have no breaking plow. You cannot bank sod against the walls before the ground freezes, which it will do inside a month." He did the arithmetic aloud because he believed in the mercy of clear numbers. He thought if he made the impossibility plain, she would sell. Other women had sold. Other women had walked to the stage office and bought passage to relatives in Minnesota or Iowa, and everyone agreed it was the sensible thing. "Eli Haugen is 1.5 miles east," he said. "If you need help before you leave, she will come." Marit looked at the shanty. She looked at the woodpile. She looked at the tree line along the northern edge of her claim, where Turtle Mountain's dense timber darkened the horizon. "I am not leaving," she said. Aslak Vangen pulled on his pipe and said nothing for a long time. Then he shook his head. "Then I will see you in the spring," he said. "Or I will not." He left. Marit watched him ride north until his horse disappeared into the band of aspen that separated her claim from the Haugen place. Then she went inside and sat on the straw tick beside Oddmund, and for the first time since the letter, she let herself feel the full weight of the numbers Aslak had stacked against her. 6 cords, $20 she did not have, tar paper she could not afford, nails she could not drive alone, sod she could not cut, a stove too small, a roof too thin, walls made of daylight and pine. She had $18.75. A 6-year-old boy with a cough that worsened near smoke, a letter from a man who was not coming back, and a winter that did not care about any of it. The question was not whether she could survive. The question was whether there existed any material, any method, any forgotten thing that could change the arithmetic. Because the arithmetic, as Aslak had laid it out, ended in a frozen room and a boy who stopped coughing because he stopped breathing. The first snow came on October 9th, not a blizzard, a quiet fall, 2 inches of wet flakes that stuck to everything and melted by noon. Marit spent the morning splitting cottonwood with a hand axe, building her half-cord into neat rows so she could count exactly what she had. Each row measured, each row insufficient. But the snow did something she had not expected. Along the northern fence line, where Peter had piled brush the previous spring, tangled willow branches, broken aspen limbs, scrub pine he had cleared from the fence posts. The snow did not melt by noon. It clung. The open prairie around it was bare and scoured by wind within an hour of the snow stopping. The brush pile held its white ridge like a wall. Marit walked to the fence. She pushed her mitten through the outer crust of the brush pile and felt the air behind it. Still, not warm, nothing was warm, but still, no movement. The wind that pressed against her back and found every seam in her shawl stopped at the tangle of branches and went somewhere else. Oddman stood beside her, coughing in the wind. His face was red and wet. She picked him up and carried him behind the brush pile, and his coughing slowed because the air was not tearing at his throat. And she remembered. Voss, Norway. She was 8 years old. Her father stood beside a stone wall where sheep sheltered in autumn storms. He had piled spruce boughs against the windward side, not for the sheep, but to show her something. He pressed green spruce tips between two boards and packed wet snow into the needles. Then he put her hand on the wall behind it. Feel, he said. The snow does not move. When snow does not move, it stops being wind. When it stops being wind, it becomes a wall. She had filed that memory the way children file things adults tell them, loosely, without understanding, alongside the smell of resin on her father's palms, and the sound of sheep bells in fog, and the warmth of stove smoke in wet wool. She had never used it. She had never needed to. Now she needed it. Marit stood at the fence line and looked at the brush pile, then at the shanty, then at the tree line. The Turtle Mountain timber belt was half a mile from her door. Dense pine, spruce, juniper, willow along the creek draws, aspen everywhere. Every neighbor wanted it for fence posts, rail ties, firewood, saleable lumber. The timber was not romantic. It was contested fuel. But the tips, the green branches, the small wood, the brush that sawyers threw aside, nobody wanted that. Nobody hauled tips. Nobody stacked needles. The idea took shape the way ice forms on still water. Slowly at first, then all at once. She would not try to heat the shanty from inside. She would stop the cold from reaching the shanty from outside. She would weave a wall of evergreen boughs around the cabin, thick enough to break the wind and catch snow in millions of needles, and the snow itself would become the insulation. Not fighting winter, recruiting it. That night, by candlelight, she sketched on a flour sack with a stub of charcoal. The cabin perimeter was 44 feet, wall height to the eaves 6 feet. She needed the bow envelope to be 24 inches thick on the north and west walls, where the killing wind came from, 18 inches on the south and east, a 4-inch air gap between the branch mass and the boards, because still air trap between two surfaces held warmth the way a blanket did. Vertical stakes, 120 aspen or willow poles 7 feet tall, driven into the ground 8 inches apart around the perimeter. Horizontal binders woven between them, peeled willow, rawhide strips, twisted hay rope, then boughs, thousands of boughs. 7,000, maybe 8,000 evergreen tips, each 2 to 3 feet long, woven into the lattice with needles facing outward and downward. Thicker ribs on the north wall every 18 inches to catch drifting snow. The stove side kept clear with a clay-daubed fire break and a bare earth trench, so sparks could not reach the green wood. She knew the dangers. Green boughs could dry, sag, and rot. If the wall collapsed inward, it could trap snow against the boards and soak them during thaw. If she packed it too tight against the shanty, moisture could freeze the door shut. If she left it too loose, wind would strip it away in the first real storm. And if the needles dried before enough snow fell to lock them in place, the whole structure would become nothing but kindling leaning against a house. The idea could save them, or it could consume the last warm weeks and leave her with no wood, no insulation, no strength, and a boy who needed all three. Eli Haugen came the next morning, 32 years old, mother of 3, the nearest neighbor. She was not hostile. She liked Marit. She had brought a jar of pickled beets and a question she had been sent to ask by Aslak Vangen. Aslak says you told him you were staying, Eli said. Marit was sharpening the hand axe on a flat stone. I am staying. He says the shanty will not hold. I know. He says you need 6 cords and you have less than 1. I know what I have. Eli set the beets on the step and watched Marit work the axe edge. She waited for an explanation. Marit gave her one, not in words, but in action. She led Eli to the brush fence. Put your hand here, Marit said. She pushed Eli's mitten through the crusted snow that still clung to the willow tangle 2 days after the squall. Now put your hand here. She guided Eli's other hand into the open wind beside the fence. Eli felt the difference. Her face changed, but she pulled both hands back and shook her head. This is not Norway, Eli Haugen said. She picked up one green branch from a pile Marit had cut that morning and shook it. Needles scattered across the ground. The wind here does not ask permission. These needles will dry and fall. Prairie wind will strip the lattice bare. Snow will melt against the boards and rot them. And the work, Marit, the work alone will exhaust you before the first blizzard. Eli's objections were real. They were the same objections Marit had written on the back of the flour sack and not yet answered. Drying needles, stripping wind, rotting boards, killing labor. I know, Marit said again. Then why? Marit looked at the shanty. Through the open door she could see Oddman sitting on the straw tick, drawing in the dirt floor with a stick. Because tar paper costs $11, she said. Delivered wood costs $20. I have $18 and a boy who coughs when the wind comes through the walls. I cannot buy my way out. I cannot dig my way out. I cannot leave. The only material I have in quantity is the thing growing half a mile from my door that every man in this settlement throws away. Eli looked at the tree line. She looked at the fence. She looked at Marit's hands, already rough from axe work and willow cutting. I think you're wrong, Eli said, but I brought beets. She left the jar and walked home. Marit watched her go and then picked up the axe. She had 6 weeks before deep cold, maybe 7. The north wall was 32 feet long and needed to be the thickest. She would start there. But the axes and the beats and the arguments were not the worst of what was coming. The worst was already forming in the mind of a man who sold wood for a living and who had been watching Marit's claim with a different kind of arithmetic. Barton Hawkley arrived on a Thursday, driving a wagon loaded with split oak that he was delivering to a farm 3 miles west. He was 44 years old, American-born, a wood hauler, store creditor, and claim speculator who had made his living in the Bottineau settlement by being the man people needed when they ran out of options. He sold firewood at $3.25 a cord to people who could pay, and at $5 a cord to people who could not pay until spring. He extended store credit at rates that turned $10 of flour into $16 of debt by March. And when settlers could not pay, he bought their claims at a fraction of the legal value. Marit's 160 acres interested him. The eastern edge of her claim bordered a timber trail that connected the Turtle Mountain Woods to the main freight road. Control that edge, and he controlled the most efficient route for hauling logs to the railroad. He had been waiting for Petter to fail since spring. Hawkley climbed down from his wagon and walked the perimeter of the shanty. He did not tap the walls the way Aslak had. He counted. He counted the boards, the gaps, the woodpile, the tools. He looked at the axe, the kettle, the single pair of boots drying beside the stove. He looked at Oddmund and did not smile. Then he made his offer. I will forgive your store debt, Hawkley said. $4.60. I will give you $5 cash on top. You sign over the improvements and vacate by December 1st. $9.60 for 160 acres, a shanty, and the only legal foothold Marit had in the territory. No, Marit said. Hawksley leaned against his wagon. He was not angry, he was patient. He had seen this before. The refusal that came from shock, the pride that would melt when the first real cold pressed through the walls. $9 buys passage to St. Paul, he said. You have family there? No. Minneapolis? No. Then where will you go when it is 30 below and you have no wood? I will not need to go anywhere. Hawksley looked at the pile of green branches Marit had begun stacking beside the north wall. Stakes were already driven into the frozen dirt, crooked, uneven, but deliberate. He looked at the willow switches soaking in the kettle. What is that? He asked. A wall, Marit said. Hawksley stared at the stakes for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh. A genuine one. The laugh of a man who had heard something so unlikely that his body responded before his mind could calculate whether it was funny or sad. A wall, he repeated. He shook his head. Marit, that is brush. That is what I throw behind my shed. You cannot wrap a house in Christmas decorations and call it insulation. Marit picked up a willow switch from the kettle. It was warm and flexible. She bent it into a loop, twisted it, and set it beside the stakes without looking at Hawksley. A woman alone cannot outbuild winter, Hawksley said. Marit knotted the willow around a bundle of pine tips. The bark cut into her thumb. A thin line of blood welled up and mixed with the green resin on her skin. Then winter will have to come close enough to prove it, she said. Hawksley climbed back onto his wagon. He looked at the shanty, the stakes, the green branches, the woman knotting willow with bleeding hands. He had the expression of a man filing something away. Not worry, not admiration, just the patient certainty that time and weather would do his negotiating for him. December 1st, he said. My offer stands until December 1st. He drove away. Marit watched the wagon until it turned onto the freight road. Then she went back to the stakes and drove 3 more into the ground with the flat of the axe. Each one sunk 8 inches deep, each one 7 feet tall, each one part of a design that existed on a flour sack and in a memory from Voss and nowhere else. By the following week, the settlement had a name for what Marit was building. Hawksley told the men at the Bottineau store, and the men told their wives. And the phrase traveled the way all phrases travel in small communities. Quickly, with embellishment, and without kindness. She is dressing that shack for Christmas, Barton Hawksley said, leaning on the store counter. Pity there will not be anyone alive inside to enjoy it. Men laughed. The image was clear and easy to mock. A woman tying green branches around a clay shanty like funeral wreaths on a fence post. Children repeated Christmas treehouse at the well. A boy Oddman's age asked him if his mother was building a bird nest or a people nest, and Oddman did not answer because he did not know. The mockery carried weight beyond cruelty. It carried a verdict. If Marit failed, and every practical assessment said she would confirm what the settlement already suspected about deserted women, about immigrants who clung to old country methods, about anyone who tried to survive the Northern Dakota winter without money, men, or sense. Her failure would be a story told at the store for years. Her success would threaten a man who sold wood. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Marit had no time to answer the laughter. She still had one wall open to the wind. The construction started in earnest on October 15th, 6 weeks before deep winter, maybe 7 if the season ran mild, which no one expected and Marit did not count on. She began with the north wall because the north wall faced the killing wind. 32 feet long, 6 feet high, and it needed to be the thickest, 24 inches of woven boughs between the outer stakes and the shanty boards, with a 4-inch air gap separating the branch mass from the wood. The first day she drove 14 stakes. Each one required digging a pilot hole with a sharpened iron rod, then hammering the aspen pole with the flat of the axe until it sank 8 inches into ground that was already stiffening with early frost. By the end of the day, her shoulders burned and her palms had blistered through both mittens. 14 stakes. She needed 42 for the north wall alone. Oddman helped by dragging willow switches from the creek draw, bundling them in groups of 10 and leaning them against the shanty wall to dry. He could not drive stakes or weave boughs, but he could sort straight willow from crooked, and Marit let him because the work kept him warm, and the warmth kept him from coughing. By October 20th, she had 40 stakes in the ground along the north wall. The line was not perfectly straight. She had no surveyor's string, only her eye and a charcoal mark on the shanty boards. But it was close enough. She began the lower weaving. The technique was simple in concept and brutal in practice. She laid horizontal willow binders between the stakes at 12-inch intervals, then packed evergreen boughs into the lattice. Needle ends outward, butt ends toward the cabin. Each bough had to be pressed tight enough to hold its neighbor, but loose enough that snow could find its way into the gaps between needles. Too tight, and wind would hit the wall like a solid surface and tear it free. Too loose and wind would pass straight through. She learned this on the third day when a gust from the northwest caught a section she had packed solid and pulled 6 boughs free in a single breath. The branches scattered across the yard. Oddman watched from the doorway and said nothing. Marit gathered the boughs, repacked them looser, and lost the rest of the daylight doing work she had already done once. By the end of October, the north wall was woven to shoulder height, 32 feet of green lattice, smelling of pine resin and wet bark, leaning slightly against the shanty like a living thing pressed there by wind. She stood back and looked at it. From a distance, it looked exactly like what Hawkley had said, a brush pile leaning against a toy house. But when she walked behind it and put her hand on the shanty boards, she felt what Aslak and Hawkley and the men at the store could not feel from the road. The boards were dry. The wind noise was lower. The air between the boughs and the wood was still, not warm, but still. And still air, her father had said, is the first thing winter has to defeat before it reaches you. The flour sack was 1/3 lighter. The woodpile had not grown. Oddman's cough came and went with the smoke, and the north wall was not finished, and the west wall had not been started, and winter was 5 weeks away, and no one believed it would work. Marit set the axe against the wall and pressed her forehead against the rough pine boards. She could hear the wind in the stakes. She could smell resin and frozen dirt and the faint sweetness of crushed needles. She was 29 years old, alone, exhausted, and building something she had seen work once, in a different country, against a different winter, in a memory she could not be certain she was remembering correctly. But the boards behind the north wall were dry, and the boards on the unprotected south side were rimed with frost. She picked up the axe and walked toward the tree line. She needed 300 more boughs before dark. The north wall collapsed on November 2nd. Not all of it. The upper third of the center section, 12 feet of woven boughs that Marit had finished 2 days earlier. A wet snow fell overnight, heavier than the October dusting, and the weight settled into the lattice and pulled the horizontal binders downward. By morning, the hay rope she had used to tie the upper courses had stretched. The boughs sagged, then slumped, then slid off the stakes in a slow green avalanche that left a gap wide enough for Oddman to walk through. Marit stood in the yard and looked at the damage. 2 days of work on the ground. Her hands were cracked across every knuckle. Her flour sack was nearly half empty. The west wall had not been started. She was kneeling in the mud, pulling wet boughs from the pile and trying to retie them with the same stretched rope when a voice came from the trail. "You are trying to tie a wall," the voice said. "Tie a basket instead." Birgit Nesheim stood at the edge of the yard, leaning on a cane made from a peeled birch limb. 63 years old. A widow from Telemark who had come to Dakota 11 years earlier with a husband who died of pneumonia the second winter. She lived in a dugout half a mile into the timber edge, where the ground was soft enough to cut and the trees blocked enough wind to make a low-ceilinged room survivable. She had worked as a cedar girl in the high pastures of Norway, woven fish traps for river camps, and cooked for Métis freighters who hauled furs through the Turtle Mountain passes in winter. Her lungs were damaged from years of smoke in low-ceilinged rooms. Her right leg was stiff from a break that had healed crooked, but her hands still knew knots, tension, and the behavior of greenwood under load. Birgit did not offer help. She did not offer sympathy. She walked to the collapsed section and picked up one of the boughs Marit had tied. She held it up and shook it. The hay rope slid off like water. "Rope pulls straight," Birgit said. "Straight pull has no grip. When the weight comes, the rope stretches and the branch slides." She dropped the bough and picked up one of the willow switches soaking in Marit's kettle. She bent it into a loop while it was still warm, twisted it once, and hooked it over a stake. Willow grips as it dries. It tightens instead of loosening. You do not tie a wall with rope. You weave it with wood. Marit watched. She had been using rope because rope was what she had. She had not thought about what happened to rope under wet snow load. "I do not need charity," Marit said. Birgit looked at the north wall, the lower 2/3 still holding, the upper third on the ground, the stakes standing bare and useless above shoulder height. "I did not offer charity," Birgit said. "I offered a correction. You measured, you cut, you marked the wall. Your mistake is structural, not lazy. Lazy I would leave alone." She sat on the chopping block and began heating willow switches in the kettle, bending each one while warm, twisting them into binding loops that she lined up on the ground like a row of small green handcuffs. Marit watched the first 3, then made the 4th herself. Birgit checked it, nodded once, and said nothing. They rebuilt the collapsed section in 4 hours. This time, Birgit showed Marit how to alternate the butt ends and needle ends of the boughs, so the lattice locked under its own pressure. When a thick branch pushed against a thin one, the thin one bent and the thick one held. When snow loaded the top, the mass compressed instead of sliding. "The wall must lean," Birgit said. She pushed the upper edge of the new section slightly outward, away from the shanty. "When the snow comes heavy, the weight presses the wall into the stakes. If the wall leans in, the snow pushes it through your cabin, outward, always outward." Marit understood. The wall was not a barrier. It was a basket that caught snow and held it still. The basket had to lean away from the thing it protected, or it would crush it. Before Birgit left that afternoon, she showed Marit one more thing. She took a short cross piece of willow and lashed it horizontally across 2 stakes on the north wall, 18 inches below the top edge. A shelf, a small ledge that jutted out from the lattice just far enough to catch drifting snow before it could slide down the face of the wall. "Snow ribs," Birgit said, "every 18 inches on the windward side. The snow catches here instead of piling at the base. The wall fills from the top down. By January, the whole north face should be solid white." She turned to leave, then stopped. Keep a hand-width gap between your boughs and your boards, she said. Still air warms. Wet wood dies. If the boughs touch the cabin, moisture will freeze the boards and rot them before spring. She walked back into the timber with her cane tapping on frozen ground. Marit watched her go and realized she had not asked Birgit why she had come, whether Aslak had sent her or Eli, or whether she had simply seen the green wall from the trail and recognized what it was trying to be. It did not matter. What mattered was that the willow ties held when Marit tested them that evening, and the snow ribs caught the next dusting, and the hand-width gap behind the boughs was something she could measure with her fist and maintain with discipline. Birgit came back the next day, and the day after that. She did not move in. She walked the half-mile from her dugout each morning, arriving when the light was strong enough to see knots, and left each afternoon before the shadows made the trail dangerous for a woman with a stiff leg. She brought nothing except her hands and her knowledge, and once a piece of dried fish that she split with Oddmund without asking Marit's permission. The construction entered a rhythm. Marit cut boughs in the morning. 300 a day was the target. 250 was the reality. She hauled them on a canvas drag that Birgit rigged from a flour sack and 2 aspen poles. Oddmund sorted willow. Birgit sat near the wall and wove binding loops, corrected angles, and watched the weather with the particular attention of a woman who had survived 11 Dakota winters in a dirt room. Birgit taught through action, not speech. Her 5th lesson was the most important. Around the stove wall, the south-facing section where the chimney pipe exited, Birgit insisted on a different standard. No boughs within 16 inches of the pipe. A collar of clay plaster mixed with sand packed into the gap between pipe and roof canvas. Bare earth scraped clean in a trench 3 feet wide around the chimney exposure. Scrap tin from an old bucket, hammered flat and nailed as a heat shield between the stove elbow and the nearest stake. "The man who sells wood," Birgit said, not using Hawkley's name. "He will call this a fire trap. He will say green boughs around a stovepipe will burn your boy alive." She pressed clay into the collar with her thumbs. "He is not wrong about the danger. He is wrong that the danger has no answer." Marit understood. The fire discipline was not just safety. It was a defense against the argument Hawkley would use when the method started working. Week 2. The west wall reached shoulder height. Oddmund could now sort 40 straight willow switches before his hands cramped. Marit's flour was down to 1/3 of the sack. Beans, 26 pounds. Salt pork, 4 pounds. She calculated meals the way she calculated boughs, by counting backward from the days she could not afford to reach. Aslak Vangen returned on November 10th. He rode up to the shanty, dismounted, and stood in front of the north wall for a long time without speaking. The wall was complete to the eaves now, 32 feet of woven green lattice, 2 feet thick, leaning slightly outward, with snow ribs every 18 inches and willow ties that did not stretch. Early snow had begun to stick in the upper courses. From a distance, the north side of the shanty looked like a hedge that had grown against a building. Aslak walked to the wall and put his shoulder against it. He pushed. The wall gave slightly, then held. He pushed harder. The stakes flexed. The boughs compressed. But the lattice did not collapse. He pulled his shoulder away and looked at the binding loops. "Who showed you the willow ties?" he asked. "Birgit Nesheim." Aslak nodded slowly. He knew Birgit. Everyone within 10 miles of the timber edge knew Birgit. "The old fish trap weaver," he said. "She is not wrong about knots." He walked the full length of the north wall, running his hand along the outer face. Needles pricked his palm. He stopped at the chimney clearance and examined the clay collar, the bare earth trench, the tin shield. "This part is good," he said. He did not say the rest was good. He did not say the rest was bad. He stood in the yard and looked at the west wall, half finished, and the south and east walls, still bare boards with stakes driven, but no weaving started. "One ice rain," Aslak said. "One freezing rain before the snow packs. The ice will coat every needle, the weight will triple, and your stakes will pull out of the ground like rotten teeth." He mounted his horse. "I was not wrong about winter, Marit. I hope you are not wrong about this." He rode away. Marit stood in the yard and counted. 32 feet of north wall done, 26 feet of west wall done, 0 feet of south wall, 0 feet of east wall. The door tunnel not started. 4 weeks until deep cold, maybe 3. She picked up the axe and walked toward the timber. The setbacks came in sequence, the way they always do when resources are thin and time is short. On November 14th, the axe handle broke. Marit was splitting an aspen pole for stakes when the wood grain gave way at the throat, and the head buried itself in frozen dirt. The handle was hickory, brought from Minnesota, irreplaceable without a trip to the Botano store. And the only replacement handles at the store belonged to Barton Hawkley, who kept a stock of them behind the counter and charged $1 each. Marit had $18.75 minus what she had spent on rope and nails. She could not spare $1, but she could not drive stakes or cut boughs without an axe. She walked to the store. Hawkley was there. He saw her come in and knew why before she spoke. $1, he said. Marit set a small cloth bag on the counter. Inside was her last coffee, a 1/4 pound of beans she had been saving since September. Coffee was worth 60 cents a pound at Botino prices. A 1/4 pound was 15 cents. "That is not $1, Hawkley said. "It is all I have that you want," Marit said. "You do not drink chicory, you drink coffee. I know because your hired man buys it by the pound." Hawkley looked at the bag. He looked at Marit. The exchange was not about coffee. It was about who could afford to refuse. He took the bag and gave her the handle. Marit fitted it to the axe head in the store yard and walked home without looking back. 3 days later, Oddmund collapsed. The fever came fast. 1 hour he was sorting willow. The next he was on the straw tick with heat pouring off his skin like a stone left in the sun. His cough deepened into a bark that shook his whole frame. Marit banked the stove, boiled water, and wrapped him in every blanket she owned. She burned a full day's worth of cottonwood, keeping the shanty warm enough for a sick child, and she did not touch the walls. 1 day lost. Half a cord of wood now closer to a 1/4 cord. The south wall still unstaked. Birgit came that evening and sat with Oddmund, while Marit drove stakes in the dark by lantern light. The frozen ground fought every stroke, 11 stakes. Her arms shook so badly by the 9th that she missed the pole and drove the axe flat into dirt. She pulled it free and kept swinging. Oddmund's fever broke the next morning. He was weak and did not sort willow for 2 days. Marit carried him outside in a blanket and set him on the chopping block in a patch of sun so he could watch her work. He asked why she was building a nest around the house. "So the wind has to argue with the branches before it argues with us," Marit said. Oddmund thought about this. "Will the branches win?" he asked. Marit did not answer because she did not know. On November 22nd, Hawkley closed the wagon trail. The trail ran through a strip of his lease between the freight road and the timber edge. Every settler used it to reach the Turtle Mountain woods for firewood, fence posts, and building material. Hawkley had never charged for access before. Now he posted a man at the entry with a notice. Hauling rights, 50 cents per load. The timing was not accidental. Marit needed 200 more boughs a day. She could not afford 50 cents she did not have, and she could not carry 200 boughs on her back through a mile of rough timber. Birgit heard about the closure before Marit did. She arrived the next morning with a different solution. There was an older path, a deer trail that wound through the aspen north of Hawkley's lease line, barely wide enough for a person dragging a canvas bundle. Métis freighters had used it 20 years earlier. It added a quarter-mile each way and crossed a frozen creek that would be dangerous after thaw, but it did not touch Hawkley's ground. Marit used the deer trail for the remaining 3 weeks of construction. Each trip took 40 minutes longer. Each trip produced fewer boughs, but each trip was free. Eli Haugen came at dusk on November 28th. She brought her 2 oldest boys in a sled loaded with willow bundles. "I'm not helping because I believe in your wall," Eli said. She stood in the yard with her arms folded and her jaw set in the particular way that meant she had argued with herself for days before coming. "I'm helping because Oddman should not pay for adult stubbornness." Eli's boys hauled willow and stacked boughs, while Eli wove a section of the east wall under Marit's direction. She was clumsy at first. Her loops were too loose, and her boughs were packed butt end out. But she learned the way Marit had learned, by doing it wrong and having Birgit correct her without speaking more than 3 words. They finished the east wall that night by lantern light. Eli looked at her own work and shook her head. "It is ugly," she said. "It does not need to be beautiful," Marit said. "It needs to be thick." By December 21st, the bough envelope was complete. North wall, 24 inches thick. West wall, 26 inches at the corner where the wind hit hardest. South wall, 16 inches. East wall, 18 inches. Door tunnel, 3 feet of brush-lined entry, angled away from the northwest wind so drifting snow could not pack straight through. Chimney clearance, 16 inches of bare clay, scrap tin, and scraped earth. A thermometer borrowed from Aslak, his one concession to curiosity, hung near Oddman's bed on a nail. The final count: approximately 7,400 boughs woven into 118 stakes with 290 willow ties and 4 clay patches around the stove side. From the road, the shanty had vanished. In its place was a squat green mound with a black chimney pipe sticking out the top and a narrow dark slit where the door tunnel began. It looked like something that had grown from the ground rather than been built on it. It looked, as Hawkley had predicted, like a Christmas tree that had swallowed a house. The first real snow came on December 26th. 6 inches in 2 hours, driven by a northwest wind that scoured the open prairie and piled drifts against anything that stood higher than grass. The bough wall caught the snow the way Birgit had designed it to. The ribs held, the needles gripped. By morning, the north wall was white from the snow shelf to the eaves, and the lattice beneath the white crust had stopped moving in the wind. That night, the temperature dropped below 0 for the first time. Marit burned 3 armloads of cottonwood and waited. In a normal shanty, single-ply boards, no banking, sheet iron stove, 3 armloads would have held the interior above freezing for perhaps 4 hours before the heat bled through the walls and the stove demanded more. Marit knew because she had lived through October that way, feeding the stove every 2 hours, waking in the dark to find frost on the inside of the boards and ice in the water bucket. This time she woke at midnight and checked the thermometer by candlelight. 42 degrees near Oddman's bed. The water bucket had a skin of ice on top, but was liquid beneath. The inside of the north wall boards, the boards she could touch by reaching behind the stove, were dry, not frosted, dry. 3 armloads instead of 6, 42 degrees instead of 28. It was not victory. 42 degrees was cold enough to see breath, cold enough to keep Oddmund under 2 blankets, cold enough that Merritt slept in her coat. But it was alive. It was water in the bucket instead of ice. It was a stove that could rest instead of a stove that had to fight. Aslak heard the number. He dismissed it. A soft night proves nothing, Aslak said. Wait for the real wind. Wait for 30 below. Then tell me your branches kept your boy alive. Eli noticed that Marit's door was not rimed shut with ice the way her own door was every morning. She said nothing, but she stopped laughing. December passed. The bow wall collected snow. The lattice disappeared under a white shell that thickened with each storm. The shanty became an igloo with corners, a snow-covered mound that barely resembled a human dwelling. The wind hit the snow shell and went over, or around, or stopped. It did not go through. But December had not been a true test. December had been cold, not killing. The temperatures had dropped below 0 on a handful of nights, but the wind had been ordinary. The storms had been brief. The snow had come in installments, not in walls. Marit watched the sky every morning. Birgit watched the sky every morning. They were waiting for the same thing, and neither of them said its name, because on the northern prairie in 1888, naming the worst storm was considered the surest way to call it. January 12th, 1888 began warm, strangely warm, the kind of warm that made men leave their coats on hooks and women open cabin doors to air out rooms that had been sealed since November. Snow dripped from branches. Ice loosened on the creek. The sky was blue in a way that felt generous after weeks of gray. Eli sent her oldest boy across the 1.5 miles to Marit's cabin to return a kettle she had borrowed in December. The boy walked in his shirt sleeves and did not hurry. Aslak Vangen rode north toward a claim inspection, whistling. Hawkley sent a hired hand, Reuben Marr, 26, a quiet man from Ohio who hauled wood and asked no questions, to move a load of split oak while the trail was soft. Marit felt the warmth and did not trust it. She had seen warm January days in Voss, and they always preceded the worst storms as if the sky needed to inhale before it screamed. Birgit arrived at noon. She did not explain why. She stood in the yard and looked north, where the horizon met the Turtle Mountain timber in a dark line. She leaned on her cane and breathed in a way that suggested her damaged lungs were reading the air pressure. "Bank the stove," Birgit said. "Fill every pot, close the entry tunnel, and bring the boy inside now." Marit did not ask why. She called Oddmund from the woodpile, where he was stacking kindling. She filled the water bucket, the kettle, and 2 tin pots from the creek. She banked the stove with the heaviest cottonwood she had and closed the draft halfway so the fire would burn slow and steady. She dragged a bundle of boughs across the tunnel entrance and packed snow against it. By early afternoon, the northern horizon had changed color. The blue was gone. In its place was a band of dirty white, not cloud, not fog, but something between them, a color that had no name except the one everyone on the northern prairie knew. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 20 minutes. Then the wind hit. It did not arrive the way storms usually arrived, building over hours, the wind rising in stages, the snow starting as flurries and thickening. This storm arrived like a wall falling. One moment the air was still and warm. The next moment the world was white and screaming, and the wind was not wind anymore, but a physical force, a weight that pressed against everything vertical and tried to flatten it. The snow was not falling. It was flying horizontally, driven by wind that would later be described by survivors across the northern plains as unlike anything they had experienced. The temperature continued to plunge. Within an hour, it was below 0. Within 2 hours, it was difficult to know exactly how cold it was because no one could stand outside long enough to read a thermometer. Marit heard the first impact against the north wall, a sound like a giant hand slapping a mattress, a deep, heavy whump as the wind hit the snow shell and compressed it. The shell held. The second impact was harder. The third was continuous. Not separate gusts, but a single sustained pressure that made the cabin boards creak inward. The candle flame leaned toward the south wall and stayed there, bent by pressure that was finding its way through seams Marit could not see. She stuffed rags into the gaps around the door frame. Birgit sat on the straw tick with Oddmund and counted stove clicks, the small metallic ticks the sheet iron made as it expanded with heat, to keep the boy calm. 112 stove clicks, 113. Then the west corner began to fail. Marit heard it before she saw it, a rhythmic thudding, like something hitting the outside wall at intervals. Not the wind. The wind was constant. This was structural. Something was loose. She pressed her ear against the west boards. The thudding was a brace. One of the diagonal aspen supports Birgit had helped install at the corners after the first collapse. The willow tie had worked loose under the sustained pressure, and the brace was swinging against the stakes with each surge of wind. If it pulled free entirely, the storm would catch the edge of the west wall lattice and peel it backward like the skin of a fruit. The boughs would scatter. The snow shell would break. The west side of the cabin would be exposed boards in the worst blizzard in living memory. "I have to go out," Marit said. Birgit looked at her. Birgit's face was difficult to read in the stove light, but her eyes were steady. "Rope around your waist," Birgit said. "Tie the other end to the door beam. Take willow, not rope, and do not let go of the wall." Marit tied a length of hay rope around her waist and knotted the other end to the beam above the door. She took 3 willow loops in her teeth because she would need both hands. She pulled the bough bundle away from the tunnel entrance and crawled into the entry. The wind found her before she reached the end of the tunnel. It came through the gaps between the tunnel boughs and hit her face with a force that closed her eyes and filled her nose with snow. She could not breathe facing north. She turned her head south and gulped air that tasted like ice and pine resin. She reached the tunnel exit and the full storm hit her. The world was gone. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon. There was only white moving at a speed that made it feel solid. The snow hit her exposed skin like sand. She could not see the west corner. She could not see the wall 3 feet from her face. She could only hear the thudding somewhere to her left and above. She crawled along the base of the wall with her left hand gripping the stakes. Her right mitten froze to a wet willow tie within 30 seconds. She pulled it free and lost a strip of wool from the palm. Her bare skin touched a snow-covered bough and stuck. She pulled that free too and felt the sting of torn skin. The thudding was closer. She reached the corner where the north wall met the west wall and found the loose brace by touch. The aspen pole was swinging in a 6-inch arc, still attached at the bottom but free at the top where the tie had snapped. Each swing opened a gap in the lattice, and each gap let wind into the structure. Marit took a willow loop from her teeth. Her hands were shaking. The wind was pushing her sideways against the wall. She could feel the rope at her waist pulling taut as the wind tried to drag her away from the cabin. She hooked the willow loop over the top of the brace and around the nearest stake, twisted it once, and pulled. The loop held, but the brace was still loose at the midpoint. She took a second loop, reached higher, and lashed the brace to the stake at shoulder height. The thudding stopped. She crawled back. The tunnel entrance was invisible. She found it by following the rope at her waist, hand over hand, until her fingers hit the bough bundle. She pulled herself inside, dragged the bundle back into place, and collapsed on the dirt floor. Her left hand was bare and bleeding. Her right mitten was torn. Her face was raw and her eyelashes were frozen together. She could not feel her feet. Birgit had not moved from the straw tick. Oddman was counting stove clicks. 247, 248. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the wall had not yet faced its worst test. Marit was inside now, but the storm was still building. The blizzard lasted 3 days. On the first night, Oddmund's fever returned. The sudden pressure change and smoke from the hard-driven stove triggered a coughing fit that lasted 20 minutes and left him limp against Birgit's shoulder. Marit could not open the stove draft wider without overfiring, and she could not open the door tunnel for ventilation without letting the storm inside. She compromised by cracking the draft a 1/4 inch and hanging a damp cloth near Oddmund's face. Birgit made him breathe through the cloth. The coughing slowed. On the second day, the wind shifted from northwest to north. This was worse. The north wall was the thickest, 24 inches of boughs under a packed snow shell, but the shift meant the wind was hitting the wall head-on instead of at an angle. The pressure increased. The boards creaked. A fine powder of snow found its way through a seam near the floor and drew a white line across the dirt. Marit stuffed the seam with rags and bacon grease. The line stopped. On the second night, the temperature outside reached its lowest point. Later, accounts from the region would describe readings approaching 35 below zero, with wind chill far beyond what any exposed flesh could survive. Marit did not know the exact number. What she knew was this. She checked the thermometer near Oddmund's bed and it read 54 degrees. She checked the thermometer near the stove and it read 62 degrees. She opened the water bucket and found liquid water. She had burned less than a 1/4 cord in 2 days. The bow wall was no longer a lattice. The storm had packed snow into every gap between every needle on every bough until the entire structure was a frozen monolith. Inches of solid snow and green compressed by wind into a shell that the wind itself could no longer penetrate. The wall had become what Birgit said it would become. The snow had stopped moving. When the snow stopped moving, it stopped being wind. When it stopped being wind, it became a wall. The candle flame stood upright for the first time since the storm began. Birgit saw it and nodded. "The boards," she said. Marit touched the inside of the north wall. Dry. She touched the west wall where she had fixed the brace in the screaming dark. Dry. She touched the south wall and felt a thin rime of frost where the bow envelope was thinnest, but even there the boards were solid and the air behind them was still. Oddmund was asleep. His breathing was rough but steady. Birgit pulled the blanket back from his neck and saw sweat on his hairline. Not fever sweat. Warmth sweat. The boy was warm enough to perspire in a blizzard that was killing cattle in open fields 10 miles away. Outside, the settlement was breaking. Eli Haugen's shanty was failing. Her door faced east, and the wind shift had driven snow through the threshold gap until a drift 2 feet deep blocked the interior. Her youngest child's blanket froze at the edge where it touched the floor. Eli tried to cross the 1.5 miles to Marit's cabin. She made it 40 yards before the whiteout swallowed the lantern light, and she could not tell the ground from the sky. She turned back and spent the night burning furniture. Reuben Marr, Hawkley's hired hand, was caught on the timber trail when the storm hit. He had been hauling the wagon back empty when the wall of white came down. He unhitched the horse and tried to ride south toward the settlement. The horse refused. It turned east, away from the wind, and walked with its head down through snow that reached its belly. Reuben could not see. He could not steer. He lay flat against the horse's neck and let the animal choose. The horse chose the only visible shape in the whiteout. The snow-covered bow wall around Marit's cabin had collected so much white mass that it stood as a low mound against the flat, screaming blankness of the prairie. Everything else had vanished: shanties, fence posts, wagons, trees. But the bow wall's snow shell was a shape, a contour, a difference in the white. The horse walked toward it and stopped. Reuben fell off the horse and crawled along the wall until he found the tunnel entrance. He pushed through and collapsed on the dirt floor beside Marit's stove. He was blue-lipped and shaking. His fingers were white. Birgit put his hands in warm water, and Marit wrapped him in the blanket she had been using herself. He did not speak for an hour. When he did, the first thing he said was, "I could see the shape of it. Nothing else. Just the shape." The storm broke on the afternoon of the third day. The wind dropped over the span of an hour, from a scream to a moan to a sound like breathing, and then silence. The silence was louder than the wind had been. Marit opened the tunnel entrance and looked out. The world was white and still and bright enough to make her squint. Snow was piled to the eaves on the north side. The bow wall was invisible under a shell of white that curved over the roof edge like a frozen wave. The stakes were buried. The willow ties were buried. The 7,400 boughs she had cut and hauled and woven were locked inside a solid mass of compacted snow that would not melt until April. The south side of the shanty, where the bow wall was thinnest, showed green tips poking through thin snow. The chimney pipe rose from the white mound and smoked quietly. Marit walked around the cabin. The structure was intact. The corner brace she had fixed in the dark held. The door tunnel was clear. The fire trench around the chimney had kept embers from reaching the bow mass. Every precaution Birgit had taught was visible in the aftermath: the outward lean that had let snow compress instead of crush, the ribs that had caught drift before it piled at the base, the breathing gap that had kept the boards dry while the world outside turned to ice. She looked at the thermometer through the door. 56 degrees. Later that day, men from the settlement began moving. They found Aslak van Gen alive but frostbitten in a neighbor's barn 2 miles north. He had lost feeling in 3 fingers and part of his right ear. They found Eli's family huddled around the remains of a table she had burned for heat. They found cattle dead in fields, and a child dead in a schoolhouse 8 miles east, where the teacher had let the students leave early because the morning was warm. They found Marit Kvami standing beside a snow-covered mound, alive, with a sick boy recovering, an old woman with bad lungs breathing clearly, and a stranger's hired hand thawing beside a stove that had burned less than a quarter cord in 3 days. Hawkley arrived the next morning. He came not to check on Marit, but to collect Reuben Marr, who worked for him and owed him a day's labor for the lost wagon. He stood in the yard and looked at the snow shell. He looked at the tunnel entrance. He looked at Reuben, who was sitting on the chopping block drinking hot water from a tin cup, alive because a horse had walked toward the only visible shape on a featureless white plain. Hawkley said nothing. He put Reuben on his horse and rode back toward the settlement. But Marit saw his face, and what she saw was not anger and not admiration. It was calculation. The face of a man who sold 6-cord winters, realizing that a woman had survived on a quarter cord and a memory from Norway. The wall had held. The boy was alive. The water bucket had never frozen solid, and the longest blizzard Marit would ever face was over. But survival, she was learning, was only the first thing winter tested. The second thing was what the neighbors did when they found out you had passed. The settlement counted its dead within a week: 1 child at the schoolhouse east of Botno, 3 cattle at the Grindheim place, a freighter's horse found standing frozen in the traces on the timber trail, still hitched to an empty wagon. Frostbite claimed parts of 11 people, Fingers, toes, ears, the tip of a nose. Aslak Vangen lost the last joint on 2 fingers of his right hand and the upper curve of his right ear. He would never grip an axe the same way again, and Merit Kvame's water bucket had never frozen solid. That fact traveled through the settlement the way Hawkley's mockery had traveled, from mouth to mouth, gaining weight with each retelling. But where the mockery had been quick and easy to repeat, the survival was harder to dismiss. A dead child was real. Frostbitten fingers were real. A quarter cord lasting 3 days in the worst blizzard anyone could remember was a number that men who burned 6 cords a winter could not ignore. Aslak Van Gen came first. He arrived 4 days after the storm, riding slowly because his bandaged hand could not grip the reins properly. He dismounted in Marit's yard and stood in front of the snow-covered bow wall. The shell was 3 feet thick on the north face now. The storm had compressed and packed the snow until it was nearly ice. He could not see a single bough beneath it. The wall looked like a snowbank that had grown against a building, except that snowbanks did not have willow stakes at measured intervals, and clay fire trenches scraped around chimney pipes. He walked the full perimeter without speaking. He touched the snow shell with his bandaged hand. He knelt at the base of the west wall and examined the corner brace Marit had fixed in the dark, the one held by 2 willow loops that had frozen solid under load and now gripped the stake with the strength of iron. Then he came inside. He stood near the stove and looked at the thermometer, which read 48 degrees on a morning when the outside air was 9 below. "I was wrong about the wall," Aslak Vangen said. He said it plainly, the way a man who has cut timber for 40 years says a thing he has measured and found to be true. "But I was not wrong about winter. That is why this matters." He did not praise. He studied. He asked to see the west corner brace up close. He asked about the willow ties, how they were heated, how they were twisted, how they tightened instead of stretching. He asked about the snow ribs and the breathing gap and the outward lean. He asked every question in the order a builder would ask, not a neighbor. Marit answered each one. She showed him the flour sack where she had sketched the original design, now stained with charcoal and bacon grease and a brown ring from the coffee she no longer had. She showed him the spacing, 8 inches between stakes, 18 inches between snow ribs, 4 inches of air gap. She showed him Birgit's clay collar around the chimney pipe. Aslak pulled a small notebook from his coat. It was the kind of notebook sawyers used to record board feet and timber orders. He opened it to a blank page and wrote Kavame Wall at the top. Then he began recording measurements. "You should write it better than I can," he said. "But I will write it first so it exists somewhere other than a flour sack." Eli Haugen came the same week. She did not announce herself. She walked into Marit's yard in the late morning, stood in front of the east wall, the section she had helped weave in November, and looked at it for a long time. "My door froze shut on the second night," Eli said. "I burned the table. Then I burned a chair. My youngest was on the floor in a snowdrift that came through the threshold." She paused. "Your door opened every morning." Marit said nothing. "Show me the tunnel," Eli said. Marit showed her. The entry tunnel, 3 feet of brush-lined passage angled away from the northwest wind, had kept the doorway clear through 3 days of horizontal snow. The angle was the key. A straight tunnel would have funneled wind and drift directly to the door. The angled tunnel made the snow turn a corner, and snow driven by wind does not turn corners well. Most of it piled against the tunnel's outer wall and never reached the door. Eli walked through the tunnel twice, crouching, feeling the walls with her hands the way Marit had made her feel the brush fence in October. "I want this for my door," Eli said. "I do not need the whole wall. I need the tunnel and the north face." "Then come tomorrow," Marit said. "Bring the boys and Willow." Within 2 weeks, 6 people had come to Marit's cabin asking questions. 2 bachelor claimants from south of the freight road wanted north wall dimensions. They had no families and no particular attachment to comfort, but they had seen the arithmetic: a quarter cord in 3 days versus a full cord per day. The wood they saved would last until March. The wood they did not save would not. A Métis freighter named Deschamps stopped his wagon on the trail and asked whether the same method could protect a calf shed. His cattle had survived the blizzard in a draw sheltered by timber, but 2 calves had frozen where the draw opened to the prairie. A half wall on the windward side of the shed would catch enough snow to break the wind without burying the animals. Marit told him to use thicker poles and wider spacing because cattle push harder than wind. A woman named Christy Solheim, recently widowed, walked 4 miles through crusted snow to see the wall. She did not ask technical questions. She stood in the yard and looked at the green mound and said, "I thought this was something only a man could build." Marit showed her the flour sack with the charcoal sketch. She showed her the willow loops that Birgit had taught. She showed her the blistered ridges across her own palms and the place on her right thumb where the bark had cut through and scarred. "Hands built this," Marit said. "Not a man's hands and not a woman's hands. Hands." Marit refused payment from everyone who came. Most of them had no money to offer anyway. Instead, she asked one thing. Anyone who learned the method must help the next household weave at least one wall. The knowledge was not hers to sell. It was hers to pass. Hawkley did not come to the cabin. He did not need to. He heard the numbers the way everyone heard them, and the numbers were worse for him than the blizzard had been. A quarter cord in 3 days, free materials, no hauling cost, no purchase necessary. Every household that wrapped even one wall in Boughs would burn less wood, which meant less wood purchased from Barton Hawkley at $3.25 a cord or $5 on credit. His business model, overpriced firewood sold to desperate people who had no alternative, required that people have no alternative. Marit's wall was an alternative made from the scraps he threw behind his shed. His first response was legal. He went to the land office in Bottineau and claimed that Marit had been cutting boughs from timber ground assigned to licensed haulers. The boughs were marketable wood. The tips were commercial product. By stripping trees on leased ground, she was stealing from men who had paid for hauling rights. The claim was weak, and he knew it. Marit had used tips, fallen limbs, and brush too small for rail ties or fence posts. The kind of material sawyers left where it fell, because hauling it cost more than burning it. Birgit, who had watched Métis freighters sort timber for 20 years, knew exactly which wood had market value and which did not. She walked to the land office with Marit and told the clerk in detail what a sawyer's leavings looked like. The clerk looked at Hawkley. Hawkley looked at the floor. "Free fuel makes thieves of poor people," Hawkley said. Marit answered, "It was not fuel. That is what you never understood." The distinction mattered. The boughs were not burned, they were woven. They did not replace wood, they reduced the need for it. Hawkley had spent months arguing that the boughs were a foolish substitute for proper firewood. Now he was arguing that they were valuable timber product. He could not have it both ways, and the clerk's face showed that the contradiction had landed. Hawkley left the land office. He did not make the claim again. But his opposition did not end. It shifted from legal to social. Quiet words at the store about fire danger, about the smell of rotting boughs in spring thaw, about what happened when a widow's experiment burned down a neighbor's barn. The words were careful. They were not accusations. They were questions planted in the minds of men who had not yet decided whether to trust a method built by a woman who talked to a crippled fish trap weaver. Birgit and Marit spent February and March refining the method. They worked in Birgit's dugout on the days when the snow was too deep to reach the cabin, and at Marit's wall on the days when the sun warmed enough to show where the lattice needed repair. The work was collaborative in a way that neither woman named. Birgit's hands knew structure, how to make a thing hold under load, where to place the bindings so tension distributed instead of concentrated. Marit's hands knew measurement, how to calculate material, how to count boughs per linear foot, how to estimate labor. Together they developed 3 refinements that would matter when the method spread. The first was removable summer panels. In spring, the snow shell melted and the boughs dried. Dried boughs lost their grip on snow and became exactly the fire hazard Hawkley warned about. Birgit suggested pegging the horizontal binders to the stakes with removable wooden pins, tapered willow dowels that could be tapped out in April, allowing the bough panels to be pulled down, dried, and stacked for autumn replacement. The wall became seasonal, not permanent. The second was the door tunnel bend. A straight tunnel worked for single cabins on open prairie, but cabins near timber or hills sometimes faced wind from unpredictable angles. Birgit designed a tunnel with a shallow S-curve, 2 slight bends instead of 1 sharp angle. The S-curve broke the wind twice and slowed drifting snow to a stop before it reached the door, regardless of wind direction. The third was the bottom gap. During thaw, snow melt ran down the bow wall and pooled at the base. If the boughs sat directly on the ground, the melt water soaked the lowest course and rotted the stakes. Birgit insisted on a 6-inch gap between the ground and the lowest binder, high enough that melt water could drain outward instead of pooling against the cabin boards. Each refinement came from a failure they had observed or anticipated. The removable panels answered Hawkley's fire objection. The tunnel bend answered Eli's concern about shifting wind. The bottom gap answered Aslak's warning about rot. One afternoon in Birgit's dugout, while Marit was sketching the tunnel bend on a piece of birch bark, Birgit told her about the cedar. "I was 14, Birgit said. Summer pastures above Rjukan. The cows went up in June and came down in September, and between those months I lived in a stone hut with a turf roof and no company except the goats and the fog." She was splitting willow as she spoke, her fingers working the green wood apart in thin strips without looking. "The hut was built before my grandmother was born, stone walls 3 feet thick, no stove, no chimney, a fire pit in the center and a hole in the roof." Marit looked up. "No chimney?" "No chimney. The smoke filled the room to the level of the hole and sat there like a ceiling. You lived beneath the smoke. Your lungs learned to breathe shallow." Birgit tapped her chest. "My lungs never forgot." "Why did you stay?" "Because the hut was warm. 3 feet of stone and a turf roof. The cold never reached the inside. Not in June when fog rolled through the pass. Not in September when the first frost came. I understood then that thickness is warmth, not fire. Thickness. If you can put enough still mass between yourself and the wind, you do not need to burn anything." Marit thought about this. The bow wall was not stone. It was not 3 feet thick, but the principle was the same: mass, stillness, and the distance between the cold air and the warm body. "You could have told me that the first day," Marit said. "You already knew it," Birgit said. "You learned it from your father in Voss. I did not need to tell you the principle. I needed to show you the knots." It was the closest either of them came to stating what the relationship was. Birgit did not teach Marit to think. She taught Marit to build what she already thought. Birgit died on March 14, 1889. The pneumonia came fast, the way it comes for people whose lungs are already damaged. 1 week she was splitting willow in her dugout. The next she was on her back in the low room with a fever that turned her breath into a rattle. Marit walked through spring mud every day for 5 days. On the third day, Birgit asked her to bring Oddmund, and the boys sat beside the old woman's bed and counted. Not stove clicks this time, but the drips falling from the dugout's thawing roof. On the fifth day, Birgit's breathing stopped between one drip and the next. Marit found the knife under Birgit's folded shawl, a small blade worn thin from years of splitting willow ties, the handle darkened with resin, and the steel still smelling faintly of smoke and wet bark. Beside it, a bundle of pre-twisted willow withes, enough for one wall panel, tied with a loop that Birgit must have made the day before she could no longer sit up. Marit carried the knife and the withes home. She put the knife on the shelf beside the stove, where the heat would keep the handle dry. She hung the withes from a nail near the door, where the air moved and the willow would cure without cracking. Oddmund asked where Birgit had gone. "Into the timber," Marit said, and because that was true in every way that mattered, she did not add to it. They buried Birgit on the hillside above her dugout, where the aspen were the thickest, and the snow was the last to melt in spring. Aslak Vangen carved the marker. Eli Haugen brought food. Hawkley did not come. Marit stood at the grave after the others left. The wind moved through bare branches above her and made a sound she had heard 1,000 times but never listened to, the sound of air meeting wood and being turned aside. The months after Birgit's death were the loneliest of Marit's life and the busiest. By autumn 1888, demand for the bow wall had spread beyond the immediate settlement. Families who had heard about the blizzard survival came from as far as 15 miles to see the cabin and ask for instruction. Marit could not visit every claim. She could not weave every wall. So she did what Birgit had done with her. She taught through action, and she made people do the work themselves. Eli's oldest boys learned to cut boughs without stripping young trees bare. Marit showed them the rule: never take more than 1/3 of the branches from a single tree, and never take the lowest ring, because that ring sheltered the roots from frost. The boys grumbled because it meant climbing higher and cutting in awkward positions, but the trees survived, and trees that survived produced boughs again the following year. Aslak, whose injured hand could no longer swing an axe with precision, discovered that he could drive stakes better than any man in the settlement. His remaining fingers were strong enough to grip a pole, and his sense of angle, 40 years of knowing what would stand and what would fall, meant his stake lines were straighter than Marit's had ever been. He taught men to drive stakes at a slight outward slant, so the weight of snow-loaded boughs pressed the wall into the ground instead of tipping it over. He did not call it Marit's method. He called it the wall. Everyone knew whose wall he meant. Marit made Reuben Marr, Hawkley's hired hand, who owed his life to a horse that walked toward a green mound in a whiteout, rebuild a failed corner section 3 times until it held. Reuben did not complain. He had crawled through the tunnel entrance half dead and woken beside Marit's stove, and he did not argue with the woman who had left the stove burning for him. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. On the frontier, one saved method could become the difference between one warm room and a row of frozen doors. In November 1889, fire came to the settlement. The autumn had been dry. The grass was brittle, and the timber was drier than anyone remembered. A wind came from the southwest, unusual for November, warm and gusting, and it carried sparks from Hawkley's fuel shed, where a hired man had been stoking a drying fire too close to stacked cordwood. The shed caught first. Dry oak and cottonwood stacked 4 cords deep, the bark curling with heat before the flame reached it. The fire jumped from the shed to the grass between the shed and the freight road. The grass burned in a line that moved toward the settlement at the speed of a walking man. Hawksley had spent months calling the bow Wall's fire traps. He had told every man at the store that green wood around a stovepipe would kill faster than winter. He had planted the word fire in every conversation about Marit's method until the word was inseparable from the idea. Now the fire was real, and it was coming from his shed. 3 cabins south of the freight road had bow walls. Eli's had a full wrap. A bachelor named Tollef Moen had a north face and a door tunnel. The widow Christie Solheim had a half wall on her windward side. Each of those cabins had green boughs, dried somewhat through summer, replaced in the lower courses with fresh autumn cuttings, but still combustible enough that a wind-blown ember could catch. Marit saw the smoke from her yard. She did not wait for someone to ride for help. She did not wait for Aslak. She walked to the settlement with Birgit's knife in her belt and a clarity in her head that felt like the old woman's voice giving instructions. At Eli's cabin, she ordered the boys to scrape bare earth trenches around the base of the bow wall, a 3-foot break between the grass and the lowest binder, wide enough that a ground fire would die before it reached the lattice. Eli's boys had shovels. They cut the trench in 20 minutes. At Tollef's cabin, she found the chimney collar, Singi, the clay and tin barrier Birgit had insisted on, intact and clear. She had wet blankets draped over the collar and the stove pipe where they exited the bow mass. The blankets would stop any ember that landed on the exposed transition between hot metal and dry wood. At Christie's cabin, the half wall was closest to the approaching fire. The grass between Hawksley's shed and Christie's claim was burning in a line 30 yards wide. Marit made a decision that cost her 1 full panel of work. She cut the south-facing section of Christie's half wall away from the stakes and dragged it into the open field, away from the cabin. The boughs burned where she dropped them, a controlled sacrifice that removed fuel from the path between the fire and the house. The fire reached the scraped trenches around Eli's cabin and stopped. It reached the wet blankets on Tollef's chimney collar and hissed into steam. It reached the gap where Marit had cut Christie's panel away and found nothing to burn. Hawksley's shed was gone. The 4 cords of split oak inside were ash. His drying fire had cost him more wood than Marit had used all winter. The cabins with Marit's fire breaks and cleared collars survived. The aftermath was quiet in the way that humiliation is quiet. Hawksley stood in the ash of his shed and watched the settlement assess the damage. 3 cabins with bow walls, untouched. His shed destroyed. The fire he had started, or his man had started, which amounted to the same thing, had tested the very objection he had been making for a year. And the objection had been answered. Not by argument, by clay collars and bare earth trenches and wet blankets, and a woman who cut a panel away before the fire reached it. Every precaution Birgit had taught was designed for this. The fire discipline was not an afterthought. It was built into the method from the day Birgit pressed clay into the chimney collar with her thumbs and said, "The man who sells wood will call this a fire trap." Hawksley did not speak to Marit that day. He did not speak to her the following week. The men at the store did not repeat his warnings about fire. The word fire detached from the word wall in the settlement's vocabulary and reattached to the word shed. But Hawksley was not converted. He was cornered. A cornered man does not apologize. He calculates. And Hawksley was still calculating, still watching the timber trail, still counting the claims along the Turtle Mountain edge, still waiting for the moment when Marit's wall would fail in a way that proved him right. That moment had not come, but winter was coming again. And Marit, alone now, no Birgit, no partnership, no one to check her knots or read the sky, would have to face it with only the things the old woman had left behind, a knife, a bundle of withes, and the spacing. Do not make them admire you. Make them remember the spacing. Birgit's last instruction. Marit repeated it to herself as she walked the stake line in November, checking each pole, testing each willow tie, measuring the breathing gap with her fist, the way she had measured it every autumn and would measure it every autumn for the rest of her life. The question was no longer whether the wall worked. The question was whether it could outlast the man who wanted it to fail. The winter of 1889 to 1890 was the winter the wall stopped being Marit's and became the settlement's. It began with the schoolhouse. The building sat on open ground a quarter-mile east of the freight road, a single-room frame structure with plank walls, a tar paper roof, and a cast-iron stove that consumed wood the way a sick animal consumed water. The teacher, a young man from Wisconsin who had come west because the territory paid better than his debts allowed him to refuse, burned through a cord and a half every month from November to March. The school board, 3 men who pooled money from families with children, spent more on firewood than on the teacher's salary. After the children's blizzard, the school board had patched the walls with tar paper and added a second layer of boards on the north side. It helped. It was not enough. The building still leaked heat through every seam, and the children still sat in coats on the coldest days, their breath visible over their slates. Aslak van Gen brought the idea to the board in October. He did not call it Marit's wall. He called it a windshell, a removable bow lattice around the north and west faces of the schoolhouse, staked and woven the same way Marit had done it, with snow ribs and willow ties and a breathing gap. He brought his notebook with Marit's measurements. He brought Eli Haugen, who described the door tunnel. He brought 2 bachelor claimants who had wrapped their own cabins and could testify to the wood savings. The board approved the project. They did not invite Marit to the meeting. Marit heard about it from Eli that evening. She was not surprised. She was not angry. She had expected that the method would travel faster than her name, and she had decided months ago that the method mattered more than the credit. Birgit had told her, "Do not make them admire you. Make them remember the spacing." She went to the schoolhouse the next morning anyway, not because she was asked, but because the north wall was 38 feet long, and the men who had volunteered to weave it were using straight rope instead of willow ties. "Rope pulls straight," she said to a man twice her size who was knotting hay twine around a bough bundle. "Straight pull has no grip. Use willow." The man looked at her. He looked at the rope in his hands. He looked at Aslak, who was standing behind Marit with his arms folded and his notebook open. "She's right," Aslak said. "I wrote it down." The man dropped the rope and picked up a willow switch. The schoolhouse wrapping took 3 days. Marit supervised the north wall. Aslak supervised the stakes. Eli taught the door tunnel to 2 women who had never woven anything larger than a basket. Reuben Marr, still working for Hawkley, but spending his free hours at the school site, handled the chimney collar, clay plaster, bare earth, scrap tin, because he had watched Birgit do it once and remembered every step. The schoolhouse was the turning point not because it was the largest wall, but because it was public. Every family with a child in the school saw the lattice go up. Every father who hauled wood to the schoolhouse would see the savings when the winter fuel bill came due. And every man who had laughed at the Christmas tree house would walk past a bough-wrapped schoolhouse every day until spring. By December 1889, 3 more households had added bough walls. Toluf Moen, the bachelor with the north face and tunnel, extended his wrap to the west wall after watching Marit's method survive both blizzard and fire. Christy Solheim rebuilt the sacrificial panel Marit had cut during the fire and added snow ribs she had not had before. A new family, the Espelon brothers, recently arrived from Stavanger, wrapped their entire cabin before their first Dakota winter and burned less wood in December than any household in the settlement. The method was spreading not because Marit promoted it, but because the arithmetic promoted itself. A wrapped cabin burned 1/3 to 1/2 the wood of an unwrapped cabin. In a settlement where firewood cost money, labor, and time, that savings was not philosophical, it was measurable. It was a cord and a half that did not need to be cut, hauled, split, and stacked. It was 2 fewer trips to the timber in January. It was a child who could sit at a school desk without seeing her own breath. Hawksley watched the schoolhouse wrapping from the freight road and said nothing. He watched the Espelon brothers wrap their cabin and said nothing. He watched his own hired man spend free hours building chimney collars for other people's houses. And he said nothing about that either, because saying something about Reuben Marr's free time meant admitting that Reuben had a reason to spend it the way he did. But the conversion, when it came, did not come through arithmetic or silence. It came through a child. In February 1890, a ground blizzard swept through the settlement without warning, not a storm of the magnitude of the children's blizzard. No one died, no cattle were lost, but a fast whiteout that reduced visibility to nothing for 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. The snow moved horizontally, close to the ground, filling every low space with white. Hawksley's niece, Randy, was 8 years old. She lived with Hawksley's sister in a house behind the store. On the afternoon of the blizzard, she had been sent to the stable, 40 yards from the store's back door, to fetch a bridle her uncle needed. She was inside the stable when the whiteout closed. She tried to walk back to the store and lost direction within 10 yards. She could not see the store. She could not see the stable behind her. She could not see the ground. She was 8 years old, wearing a house coat and no mittens, standing in a white nothing that had no edges. She walked. She did not know which direction. She walked because standing still in a whiteout is the thing that kills, and even an 8-year-old knows to move when the cold starts to bite. The shape appeared out of the white, the way Marit's cabin had appeared to Reuben Marr's horse 2 years earlier, not as a building, not as a recognizable structure, but as a difference, a contour in the blankness, a place where the white had a shadow. Randy walked toward it because it was the only thing she could see. It was the bough-wrapped shed behind the schoolhouse. Marit had helped build it the previous autumn, a small storage structure where the school's firewood was kept, wrapped on 3 sides with a half wall of woven pine boughs. The boughs had collected snow all winter. The snow shell made the shed visible in a whiteout when every flat-walled building had vanished into the horizontal white. Randy pressed herself against the wind shadow on the sheltered side of the shed. The bow wall broke the wind. The snow shell blocked the ground drift. She was still cold, still without mittens, still 8 years old in a blizzard, but she was alive and out of the wind. And when men came looking 30 minutes later, following the same visible contour she had followed, they found her curled against the lattice with her hands tucked inside her coat and her face pressed against green boughs that smelled like pine resin and frozen bark. Hawksley arrived after the rescue. He arrived at Marit's cabin, not the schoolhouse, because that was where the men had taken Randy, to the warmest room in the settlement, the room inside the green mound, the room where the water bucket never froze. Hawksley stood in the doorway of the tunnel entrance. He had to stoop to enter the way everyone did, because the tunnel was not built for tall men. It was built for breaking wind. He came inside and saw his niece wrapped in a blanket beside Marit's stove, drinking hot water, her cheeks red but her fingers pink and moving. He looked at the girl. He looked at the stove. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, which read 51 degrees while the whiteout screamed outside. He did not apologize. He did not praise. He did not say he had been wrong, because men like Barton Hawksley do not carry that sentence in their vocabulary the way Aslak Vangen did. What he said was this: "Tell me the spacing again." Marit looked at him. She had imagined this moment, or some version of it, for 2 years. She had imagined anger, or satisfaction, or the pleasure of watching a man who had mocked her ask for her help. What she felt instead was something quieter. She felt tired. She felt like Birgit's voice was in the room saying, "Do not make them admire you." 8 inches between stakes, Marit said. 18 inches between snow ribs. 4 inches of air gap. Willow ties, not rope. Outward lean. Clay collar around the chimney. Bare earth 3 feet wide. Hawksley repeated the numbers under his breath. He did not write them down. He repeated them the way a man repeats something he intends to memorize. Then he picked up his niece and carried her home. 2 weeks later, Hawksley sent 2 wagon loads of scrap poles to the schoolhouse. Aspen and willow, sorted by length, stacked clean. Enough material to rewrap the schoolhouse's east wall, which had been left bare the first year because of material shortage. He did not deliver the poles himself. He sent Reuben Marr. He did not attach a note. He did not ask for thanks. The poles appeared on the schoolhouse grounds in the morning, and everyone in the settlement understood what they meant. Barton Hawksley's conversion was not a speech. It was lumber. Halvor Tveit arrived in the settlement in March of 1890, driving a freight wagon loaded with carpentry tools and a quiet manner that people mistook for shyness until they watched him work. He was 36 years old, widowed, a carpenter and freight repairman from a Norwegian community in western Minnesota. His wife had died of typhoid 3 years earlier. He had no children. He had come to Dakota because Minnesota reminded him of her in ways he could not fix with a saw, and Dakota did not remind him of anything yet. He first appeared at Marit's cabin because Aslak sent him. Aslak had met Halvor at the land office and recognized a man who understood wood the way a good carpenter does, not as material, but as behavior. Wood moves. Wood breathes. Wood remembers the direction of the grain and the year of the drought and the side of the tree that faced the wind. A carpenter who understands this builds things that last. A carpenter who does not build things that split. Halvor came to see the bow wall. He walked the perimeter the way Aslak had, but slower, and he stopped in places Aslak had not. At the roof line, where the bow lattice met the tarred canvas, and at the base, where the 6-inch drainage gap let air circulate beneath the lowest binder. "The roof line is a problem," Halvor said. It was the first thing he said to Marit, and it was a criticism. Marit crossed her arms. "The roof line holds." "The roof line holds now," Halvor said. "But in spring, the melt runs off the snow shell and drips behind the lattice at the eaves. The water sits on the canvas and rots it. In 2 years, you will need a new roof, and the roof is the most expensive part of the cabin." Marit had noticed the drip line. She had not solved it. "What would you do?" she asked. Halvor looked at the eaves for a long moment. Then he took a piece of charcoal from his pocket. Carpenters carry charcoal the way other men carry tobacco, and sketched on the cabin wall. "A hinged frame," he said. "Aspen poles bolted to the top stake with a pin joint. In winter, the frame folds down against the lattice and the boughs pack around it like everything else. In spring, you pull the pins and the frame swings up and out, making a 3-inch overhang above the eaves. The melt drips forward, off the frame, onto the ground in front of the wall instead of behind it." It was a good design. It was also wrong. "The overhang blocks the airflow at the top of the breathing gap," Marit said. "Warm air rises inside the gap and exits at the eaves. If you close the top, the warm air stays and condenses on the inside of the boughs. You get frost inside the lattice instead of outside." Halvor stared at the sketch. He stared at the eaves. He erased a line with his thumb and redrew it. "Slotted frame," he said. "Gaps every 6 inches in the overhang. Water drips through the slots, most of it forward,
some through, but the airflow is not blocked. Marit looked at the revision. She nodded. Then teach my hands, Halvor said. It was not a phrase a man said to a woman in Dakota Territory in 1890. It was not a phrase that fit the settlement's understanding of how knowledge moved, from experienced men to younger men, from fathers to sons, from authority to dependence. Halvor said it because he meant it, and because he was a carpenter who had just met a better design than his own and wanted to understand it the way his hands understood wood. They built the slotted frame together over 2 days. Halvor cut the joints. Marit set the pin spacing. They argued about the hinge mechanism. Halvor wanted iron pins. Marit wanted wooden dowels that could be replaced without a forge, and compromised on iron pins with wooden backup dowels stored inside the tunnel. They tested the frame by pouring water from a bucket along the roof line and watching where it went. Most of it went forward. The rest fell through the slots. The airflow at the eaves continued uninterrupted. That works, Halvor said. That works, Marit said. They looked at each other across the roofline with the expression of two people who have just discovered that disagreement can be a form of collaboration. Halvor smiled. Marit did not smile, but she did not look away either. The courtship was not a courtship in any way the settlement would have recognized. There were no Sunday visits, no gifts of fabric, no formal conversations between Halvor and a male relative Marit did not have. There was work. Halvor built a better stake driver, a weighted mallet with a socket that fit over the pole top so the blow drove the stake straight instead of splitting it. Marit rejected his first design because the socket was too tight and jammed on wet wood. He revised it. She tested it. It worked. Halvor rebuilt the door tunnel with proper joinery, mortise and tenon corners instead of lashed poles. Marit told him the joints were beautiful and unnecessary. He said unnecessary and beautiful were not the same thing. She said on the frontier they were. He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard a man laugh in her cabin since Peter left. Oddman liked Halvor because Halvor did not talk to him the way adults talk to children. Halvor talked to Oddman the way he talked to wood, directly, specifically, and with the assumption that the listener was paying attention. He showed Oddman how to measure a right angle with a knotted string. He showed him how to read grain direction by running his thumb across the end of a board. He did not try to replace Oddman's father. He tried to be useful to Oddman's life, which was a different thing and a better one. They married in the spring of 1891 after the schoolhouse wrapping was complete, and the settlement had accepted that Marit Kavam was not leaving, was not failing, and was not going to stop teaching anyone who came to her door with willow and a question. The wedding was small. Aslak Vangen witnessed. Eli Haugen brought food. Oddman stood beside his mother and held the willow wreath that Halvor had woven, a circle of green switches twisted with the same technique Berget had taught, the ties tightening as they dried. By 1892, the numbers told the story. 23 cabins in the Bottineau settlement used some version of Marit's bow wall. Not all were full wraps. Some had only a north face. Some had only a door tunnel. Some had half walls on barns and calf sheds. But every version used the same principles: willow ties, outward lean, snow ribs on the windward face, breathing gap, clay collar around the chimney, bare earth fire trench, removable summer panels. The schoolhouse had a full removable winter windshell that went up in October and came down in April. The teacher reported that his firewood consumption had dropped by nearly half. The school board spent the savings on a second stove, and for the first time children on the far side of the room could write without gloves. Aslak kept the measurement book. The first page still said Kavame Wall in his sawyer's hand. By the third year, the book had entries from 14 different households, each with notes on local variations, thicker walls for exposed claims,
thinner walls for claims sheltered by timber, double tunnels for cabins with 2 doors, half walls angled to catch prevailing wind. Eli Haugen taught door hoods to new families before Marit arrived. She had become the settlement's first instructor for the simplest version of the method, the entry tunnel that could be built in a single day by a family with no carpentry skills. Eli did not weave walls. She wove tunnels, and tunnels saved lives in whiteouts because a tunnel gave the door a chance to open when everything else was frozen shut. The method spread because it was cheap, teachable, and adaptable. It did not require money. It did not require a man. It did not require anything except green boughs, willow, stakes, and the willingness to work until your hands bled and then work more. Marit and Halvor built a larger house in 1893. Proper lumber, sod banking at the base, a timber frame with real joinery, and glass windows that did not frost white by morning. Halvor designed it. Marit insisted on removable bow panels on the north and west faces, even though the thicker walls did not strictly need them. Habit, she said when Halvor asked. Stubbornness, Halvor said. Those are the same word, Marit said. I learned that from a woman in a dugout. Oddmund survived childhood. His cough faded as he grew into the drier air of the new house and the warmer rooms that came with proper insulation. He attended the bough-wrapped schoolhouse and learned arithmetic from a teacher who no longer had to burn furniture in February. He grew tall and quiet and precise, like his mother, and when he was old enough to hold a charcoal stick without breaking it, he began writing the spacing rules on the schoolhouse wall each November, 8 inches between stakes, 18 inches between ribs, 4 inches of air gap. Willow, not rope. He wrote them in the same careful hand every year until he became the teacher himself. Marit kept Birgit's knife by the stove in the new house, on the same shelf where it had sat in the old shanty. The handle darkened further with years of stove heat. The blade wore thinner. She used it every autumn to split the first willow ties of the season, and every autumn the knife smelled faintly of smoke and wet bark, as if the old woman's dugout still lived somewhere inside the steel. Marit Kavama died in 1926 at the age of 68, on the same claim she had nearly lost 39 years earlier. She had outlived Peter, who was found dead in a Montana boarding house in 1903 with no money and no letter. She had outlived Hawkley, who sold his store in 1898 and moved to Bismarck, where no one knew his name. She had outlived Aslak, who died at 84 with the measurement book still on his shelf. She had not outlived the wall. By the time Marit's hands stiffened with age, at least 36 families around the Turtle Mountain edge knew some version of the bow wall. Not all wrapped whole cabins. Some built only a north shield, some made door tunnels. Some used brush fences to catch snow before it reached barns. But the core principle, stop the wind first, let the snow become still, make the cold spend itself before it touches the wall, remained in every version, carried forward by hands that had learned from hands that had learned from hands. Marit lived out her life on the original claim. Her larger house had proper lumber, a better stove, and glass windows. But every November she walked the old wall line where the first shanty had stood and checked the windward stakes, though the shanty itself was gone and the stakes were rotting. Oddmund, grown and teaching, said she did it from habit. Marit said winter respects habit. She is dressing that shack for Christmas, Barton Hawksley had said in the autumn of 1887, leaning on the store counter while men laughed. Pity there will not be anyone alive inside to enjoy it. But the green wall that looked foolish from the road became the shape people searched for in whiteout, the only contour visible when the prairie went white. The needles that were supposed to dry and scatter held snow. The snow that was supposed to bury her became the thing that kept the wind away.
Marit's old cabin, years later, no longer lived in, still showed faint stake holes in a line around the foundation. In winter, snow gathered there first, as if the ground remembered where the wall had been. The prairie did not become kinder. Marit Kavamas simply taught it where to stop.